Hi everyone, welcome back to Ways of the World, a brief global history with sources. As we sum up our study of China and the world, East Asian connections. And today we're going to look at China and Buddhism. So let's start with making Buddhism Chinese. Buddhism entered China via Silk Roads in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. Had little appeal at first, and Indian culture was just too different from Chinese. But it began to take root 300 to 800 CE. There's the collapse of the Han Dynasty circa 200 CE, which brought chaos, thus discrediting Confucianism. Nomadic rulers in northern China favored Buddhism. Buddhism was confronting, and monasteries provided an increasing array of social services. Buddhists appeared to have access to magical powers, and there was a serious effort to present Buddhism in a form that was accessible to the Chinese. And it was the Mahayana form of Buddhism that became popular. Now, the Sui and early Tang dynasties gave state support to Buddhism. The Sui Emperor Wendi, who ruled from 581 to 604, had monasteries built at base of China's 5 sacred mountains. The monasteries became very wealthy, and Buddhism was never independent from state authorities. All right, the world of Asian Buddhism. Originating in India, Buddhism later spread widely throughout much of Asia to provide a measure of cultural or religious commonality across this vast region. Let's trace the routes and speed with which Buddhism spread from its heartland along the Ganges River. How quickly did it reach China, Korea, Japan, and Tibet? And why might it have taken longer to become established in Korea, Japan, and Tibet? Well, from its origins in the 5th century BCE, it took 3 to 8 centuries to reach China and 8 to 13 centuries to reach Korea, Japan, and Tibet. And the distance in the case of Korea, for example, and geographic obstacles, mountains in the case of Tibet, and the sea in the case of Japan, hindered its diffusion in those areas. And Japanese cultural seclusion also may have played a role. Now, the Silk Roads identify regions where Buddhism spread along this long-distance trade route. How quickly did Buddhism establish itself along the Silk Roads? Well, initially, the Silk Roads rapidly diffused the faith, and it reached those Indian areas served by the Silk Roads, largely marked here in pink, no later than the 2nd century BCE. Thereafter, it took a while to reach the Chinese regions along the Silk Roads, getting there 3 to 8 centuries after its founding. All right, losing state support, the crisis of Chinese Buddhism. Well, there's growth of Chinese Buddhism that provoked resistance and criticism. The deepening resentment of the Buddhist establishment's wealth. It was foreign, thus offensive, and monastic celibacy and withdrawal undermined the Confucius-based family system. And so a new xenophobia perhaps started with An Lushan rebellion, 755 to 763, led by a foreign general. The Chinese state began direct action against foreign religions in 841 to 845. 260,000 monks and nuns were forced to return to secular life. Thousands of monasteries and temples and shrines were confiscated or destroyed. And the Buddhists were forbidden to use precious metals or gems for their images. And Buddhism did not vanish from China, however. It remained an important element of popular religion. All right, scholars gathering in a bamboo garden, 12th century. So the close association of China's scholar class with the country's political life is reflected in this source, which shows a group of scholar officials drinking tea and wine together with the emperor, who is presiding at the left. The painting is usually attributed to the emperor Huizhong, 1082 to 1135, who is himself a noted painter, poet, calligrapher, and collector. This emperor's great attention to the arts rather than to affairs of state gained him a reputation as a negligent and dissolute ruler. Yes, that's what I'm trying to say. His reign ended in disgrace as China suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the northern nomadic Jin people who took the emperor captive. Now let's analyze the relationship between the scholar officials and the Chinese state during the Sung period. Scholar officials were vital contributors to the Chinese state's sense of order and decorum, both within government and in larger society. All right, scholars of the Luili Hall, late 13th century. Confucian cultural ideas gave great prominence to literature, poetry, and scholarly pursuits as activities appropriate for quote-unquote gentlemen. Confucius himself declared that, quote, gentlemen make friends through literature and through friendship increase their benevolence, end quote. For some, a more reclusive life devoted to study, painting, poetry, and conversation with friends represented an honorable alternative to government service. Thus, literary gatherings of scholars and officials were common themes in Tang and Sung dynasty paintings. And this source provides an illustration of such an event. It portrays the 8th century poet official Wang Qiangning, shown in his red scholar official's robe, seated by the table talking with 3 friends. So based on this image, analyze the values of the upper classes in 13th century China. So those values depicted here include leisure, small group discussion, intellectualism, and learning. All right, on a mountain path in spring, early 13th century. Chinese scholar officials are often shown as solitary contemplatives immersing themselves in nature. The famous Sung dynasty painter Ma Yuan, 1160 to 1225, depicted such an image in his masterpiece entitled On a Mountain Path in Spring, showing a scholar walking in the countryside watching several birds while his servant trails behind carrying his master's lute. A short poem in the upper right, composed by the reigning emperor Nianzhong, reads, quote, the wildflowers dance when brushed by my sleeves. Reclusive birds make no sound as they shun the presence of people, end quote. So let's analyze the ways in which this painting reflects the influences of Chinese religious and philosophical traditions. So this painting clearly reflects the Taoist influence of being engaged with nature and the Buddhist emphasis on harmony. Analyze the historical situation. In what ways might the artist have been influenced by the growing Mongol threat from the north? Well, periods of foreign threats and social disorder often push people to eschew the quote-unquote civilized world and return to nature is evident in this painting. All right, the night revels of Han Shijai. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. 10th century. Not all was poetry and contemplation of nature in the lives of China's scholar officials, nor were men and women always so strictly segregated as the preceding sources may suggest. This source illustrates another side of Chinese elite life. These images are part of a long 10th century scroll painting titled The Night Revels of Han Shijai. Apparently, the Tang Dynasty Emperor Li Ju became concerned that one of his ministers, Han Shijai, was overindulging in suspicious night-long parties in his own home. He therefore commissioned the artist Gu Hongzhong to attend these parties secretly and to record the events in a painting, which he hoped would shame his wayward but talented official into more appropriate and dignified behavior. The entire scroll shows men and women together, sometimes in flirtatious situations, while open sleeping areas suggest sexual activity. Let's analyze the gender roles of the Chinese elite as depicted in the painting. This painting shows men and women intermingling, something that was generally frowned upon in elite Chinese society. Though several women interact with men without any of the subservience expected from a Confucian-centered society. The majority of the partygoers are male, but most of the women appear to be there as servants or entertainers. And that concludes our study of China and Buddhism. I will see you guys next time.